Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the massive, incredibly complex machinery of India's local governance. We're diving into the Panchayati Raj system, which is this fantastic framework that was meant to bring democracy directly down to the village level. But as we're going to see, there is often a pretty significant gap between those grand constitutional ideals on paper and the gritty, everyday, ground-level realities. Let's get into it. I want to start with a truly staggering fact. There are roughly 3.2 million elected representatives across India's local governments right now. Just to put that into perspective for a second, the number of elected local leaders in India is literally larger than the entire population of many countries. It's an absolutely breathtaking scale of democratic participation.
But that brings us to the core question of our analysis today. Despite this totally unprecedented, awe-inspiring scale of representation, do these local bodies actually hold real power to change their communities? I mean, are they truly institutions of local self-government, or are they really just administrative outposts for higher levels of power?
So, looking at the timeline to understand how we got here, the constitutional origin of the modern Panchayati Raj goes back to 1992 with the landmark 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act. This was a massive game changer, right? It finally granted these rural institutions formal constitutional status. And that set into motion decades of ongoing developments. We have current campaigns in 2026 actively pushing back against proxy leaders, and future milestones too, like 2030, which actually marks the expiration date for certain scheduled caste and scheduled tribe reservations under Article 334. Now, that 1992 amendment established a wonderfully uniform three-tier system across the entire country, designed to seamlessly decentralize power. At the top, you've got the district level, the Zilla Parshad. Below that is the intermediary block level, the Panchayat Samiti. And finally, right there, closest to the people, is the village level, the Gram Panchayat. It's a structure built from the ground up for deep, localized governance. And at the very foundation of this whole system is the Gram Sabha. This is basically the primary assembly made up of all registered voters in a village. It's really meant to be the ultimate symbol of direct democracy. This is the mechanism where regular, everyday citizens can keep their elected panchayat leaders accountable, review the budgets, and actually decide on local priorities themselves.
Part 1. The Silent Revolution. Women in Local Governance. This whole constitutional framework sparked what a lot of people call a silent revolution. It led to one of the most remarkable global feats of political empowerment, women's reservation in local government. Today, thanks to original mandates that reserved at least 1/3 of seats for women, which, by the way, over 20 states have proactively bumped up to 50%, the landscape of local politics is totally transformed. Women currently make up 46.6% of all elected panchayat representatives. That is roughly 1.5 million women in leadership positions. It easily makes India a top-performing country globally when it comes to women's political empowerment at the local level.
And they're making a massive difference on the ground. Studies and surveys show that these female leaders have actively redefined local priorities. They're actually statistically less likely to be associated with corruption. And they heavily invest in essential human infrastructure. We're talking about things like health, education, and safe drinking water facilities. They are literally changing the very nature of what local government cares about. But we have to talk about the friction here between the rule of law and these deeply entrenched social barriers. Enter the Sarpanch Pati phenomenon. This is a widespread, honestly deeply problematic practice where the husbands or male relatives of elected women leaders exercise the actual authority on their behalf. So a woman might hold the seat on paper, but she's often just reduced to a figurehead while proxy leaders make the actual decisions. It's such a pervasive issue that the government actually had to launch a nationwide campaign in 2026 just to try and curb this exact practice. On top of that, these women face immense logistical hurdles. A severe gender digital divide and low technical literacy drastically hamper their ability to govern. For instance, there was this eye-opening survey in Bihar that revealed only 24% of female representatives even owned a smartphone. When modern governance relies so heavily on digital portals and communication, this lack of basic access structurally disadvantages female leaders from efficiently conducting their daily administrative functions. Part 2. The Systemic Bottleneck. Functions, funds, and functionaries. Beyond the social barriers, we absolutely have to look at the foundational, systemic flaws of the 73rd Amendment itself. And specifically, I'm talking about state government discretion. Here is where the real design flaw lies. The Constitution includes the 11th Schedule, which lists 29 subjects, everything from agriculture to rural development, that could be transferred to local control. But notice that word could. States are not legally forced to hand these over. In practice, fewer than 20% of states have actually transferred all 29 subjects to their panchayats. State governments are basically acting as the ultimate gatekeepers of decentralization. Which brings us to a truly shocking number, 1%. Because states aren't forced to hand over real taxation authority, panchayats generate a painfully low 1% of their revenue through their own local taxes. Think about that. When you can't raise your own money, you can't make your own plans. You become entirely dependent. This total lack of financial autonomy forces panchayats to rely almost entirely on grants from higher up the chain. And what's worse, the nature of those grants is changing. The share of untied grants, those are flexible funds panchayats can use for whatever their specific village actually needs, has steadily declined from 85% down to 60%. Instead, they're getting tied grants, which is money strictly restricted to pre-decided schemes chosen by the state or central government. And this financial starvation, it triggers a whole cascade of other problems. You end up seeing severe bureaucratic dominance, where unelected village secretaries are the ones holding the real power over approvals and fund releases. You see interference by local MLAs and MPs. Plus, because there's this massive lack of technical training and a huge shortage of administrative staff, many elected panchayat members are just left completely overwhelmed by the paperwork. This, again, further reduces them to mere figureheads in your own institutions. Part 3. The Financial Future. Finance Commissions and the Path Forward. So, considering all these massive hurdles, how is the government attempting to bridge this enormous financial and administrative gap? Well, a major piece of the puzzle comes from the finance commissions. The 16th Finance Commission recently stepped in, evaluating the entire devolution framework. They've tabled their recommendations for the 5-year period from 2026 to 2031, really aiming to inject some much-needed capital directly into the grassroots level. And the numbers here are massive. The commission has earmarked a total of 4.35 lakh crore rupees specifically for rural local bodies. They've structured it with an 80-20 split. 80% are basic grants, half of which are thankfully untied, while the other half are tied to critical needs like sanitation and water. But interestingly, 20% are now performance grants. These are heavily linked to the panchayats hitting specific targets for growing their own source revenue. Basically, they're trying to financially incentivize financial independence. And this brilliantly illustrates that the system isn't structurally doomed everywhere. When you look at the ministry's devolution index, states like Kerala, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu consistently rank as top performers. They have willingly devolved more functions, more funds, and more functionaries straight to the local level. It just proves that with genuine political will from the state capital, panchayats can, and absolutely do, function exceptionally well. Now, to help bolster capacity across all the other states, the Ministry of Panchayati Raj is heavily rolling out digital tools. We're talking platforms like the eGram Swaraj portal for decentralized planning and real-time payments, Audit Online for financial transparency, and these massive training programs under the Rashtriya Gram Swaraj Abhiyan, which aim to upskill these millions of elected representatives. Ultimately, what we see is that the weaknesses of the panchayat system are totally intertwined. A lack of mandatory fiscal devolution feeds financial dependence. That dependence feeds bureaucratic dominance. Weak technical capacity deepens that reliance, and social barriers weaken the Gram Sabha's ability to actually hold their leaders accountable. It is a vicious cycle, and it's exactly why piecemeal Band-Aid fixes rarely work when states just continue to act as the gatekeepers. Which leaves us with a critical, somewhat provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. For grassroots democracy to truly flourish the way it was envisioned back in 1992, is it time to constitutionally strip state governments of their discretionary gatekeeping powers? Like, should the transfer of functions and funds be made an absolute constitutional mandate? It's a massive, massive question for the future of the world's largest democracy. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning how the systems around you really work.